Right, so welcome to this session on practical ideas to teach through outdoor learning through the Science and Technology AOLE. Now, this is a repeat of the course that I did in January. I've been running a 20-week course covering all the AOLEs and every aspect of outdoor learning, which is still running. So hopefully this information is going to help you to teach outdoor learning and teach your science and technology aspects of the AOLE through outdoor learning. I'm going to share a PowerPoint with you, which at the end of the session you will be sent. You will also be sent a recording of this, which will be embedded in into the PowerPoint that you get sent. So you'll be able to go backwards and forwards. So don't feel you have to write copious amount of notes because it'll all be available to you. So I'm just going to share my screen. Okay, so hopefully you can see that. So we're going to be working through all of the AOLEs, but just a bit of housekeeping first of all. First of all, please keep your microphones on mute, as you know by now that we get feedback if people start unmuting. If we have time for questions, which hopefully we will throughout the time, then feel free to unmute to ask questions, or you can use the chat function. And as I've said, I'm going to be recording this session and you will be sent a recording of it embedded in the PowerPoint. If we have time at the end, we'll do breakout rooms, but chances are we won't because there's so much content to cover. My contact details are here, which will be embedded in the PowerPoint as well, which you'll get. So if you do have any questions that we didn't get a chance to answer, then please do feel free to contact me and I will try and answer them after that. First of all, if this is your first introduction to Nature Days and to me and coming to my course, welcome, thank you for coming. And just a bit of background about myself. So I run Nature Days, which is an outdoor learning provision. I do field trips. I also do insets and teacher training and ad sessions, and now online stuff as well because of COVID. But I'm based on Gower in South Wales, and most of my fieldwork takes place around the Gower countryside. But I also I'm traveling all over the country now to provide inspirational ideas for teaching the new curriculum in school grounds and in your local area. So in terms of what happened in COVID, obviously not a lot of going outdoors happened for schools. So I turned online and I started creating resources online. So I've got a YouTube channel that's got outdoor challenges for every day of the lockdown for doing outdoor learning using your garden, which can be used in your school grounds as well now. I also created some resources like these outdoor challenge cards as well. So what Nature Days aims to do is really to empower people who are trying to get their students to learn the curriculum to use the outdoors for that effect and to give them the confidence to use it as a pedagogy to deliver the curriculum for Wales. So I'm very, very much embedded into the curriculum for Wales and know a lot about it because I've been really going through it and trying to find as many opportunities as we can for making it an outdoor learning curriculum as well. What we're planning to cover in this session today is obviously trying to look at the curriculum of the area of learning that we're looking at, the science and technology. So I'm going to go through the what matters statement content and the progression steps which occur through each. And then I'm going to give you practical ideas for teaching each of those what matters statements using the outdoors as a resource. And I'm also going to cover the key considerations for this area as well. And if you're not sure what those are, I'll tell you a bit about those when we get to that point. So I will be looking at the background for the AOLEs, but the focus is on the application. So all the ideas that I give you, hopefully you can adapt to use in your school grounds and for your learners. So we're going to go through all 6 of the what matters statements. Bit of background first of all, I'm not sure how aware you are obviously in the new curriculum, but the new curriculum is divided into these 6 AOLEs, and the science and technology AOLE, or area of learning and experience, is divided into 6 what matters statements. And each what matters statement is divided into these 5 progression steps, which are meant to be achieved by the time for progression step 1 at the end of age 5, sort of, which is end of reception. Progression step 2 at the end of age 8, which is kind of the key stage 1 or key stage 1. Progression step 3 is for the end of primary. Progression step 4 when we get to age 14, and progression step 5 when we get to end of key stage 4. I'm going to be covering all of the progression steps, but we will be focusing in on primary. I can move it into secondary if you need it, but the majority of people who are on this course are probably primary. If for some reason you are desperate for some secondary ideas, please put it in the chat, or you can email me afterwards and I can give you loads of ideas. A lot of it can be adapted for secondary. Just a bit of background for myself, I am actually a secondary science teacher, so I'm working at the secondary end anyway, but I actually teach more primary now than I do secondary in terms of science. So if you're looking at HUB and looking at the curriculum for Wales, you will see you've got your descriptors of learning, and underneath that, you've got another thing you need to click on, because that's got what's called the key considerations for each of the AOLEs. There's an awful lot of words in there, and it's really not easy to access because you'll scroll right down, but there are some very important bits inside it, especially for the science and technology AOLE. And this is the key considerations. So the key considerations for the AOLE is almost in this one, they're trying to tell you what content to cover. So the content they expect you to cover is identified in these 15 items here. So it's quite clear, if you look at the what matters statement, you know what scientific skills you need to cover, but it's not necessarily what content in terms of the scientific knowledge you need to cover. So this is where it is hidden. It is hidden away in these key considerations. So I'm going to make sure I can go through the content and this key considerations for each of the what matters statement briefly when I go through your ideas of how to teach the relevant content through the what matters statements. So here we go with the what matters statement. So starting with what matters statement 1. Now, what matters statement 1 is all about being curious and searching for answers. But in effect, this is actually essentially teaching the scientific investigation process or the scientific method. So if you're not aware of the scientific method, then really all you need to do is look through the progression steps, because the progression steps tell you the stages of it. So in progression step 1, it says about exploring the environment and making observations and communicating ideas. So really what you're doing is asking questions, and that's the first stage in the inquiry, in the investigative process. Then when we move on to progression step 2, 3, 4, and 5, we get the whole of the inquiry process coming in. So we've got that initial question. Then we've got the method that you need to identify to answer that question. Then you've got some predictions, opportunities to make models at progression step 4, then data collection, and then an analysis. And then when you get to progression step 3 and 4, we're looking at drawing conclusions based on that data collection, and then evaluating our methods for progression step 3 and 4. As well as that, at the bottom end of the what matters statement 1, we've also got this add-on, which is all about impact on the environment. So it's covering ways in which we can the environment can be impacted on us in a positive and a negative way. Now, for some reason, the what matters statement content for what matters statement 1, all the scientific process, is actually repeated in lots of the other what matters statements. I'm not sure why they've done that. So what I've done is I've drilled down to the relevant topics and the content which is in each of the what matters statement, so that I don't repeat the same thing over and over. And I've created these tables because I find when you go on HUB and you've got to click to go to the next progression step, it's really difficult to get that overarching view of where your learners are coming from and where they are going to. So within the specific considerations for this area, we also need to consider different types of inquiry. So we need to build this scientific procedural knowledge, and it actually specifies within that this out of classroom learning. So they do expect you to undertake scientific inquiries outside as well. They also want you to undertake a range of practical techniques, and this becomes increasingly more complex as you go through the progression steps. So you've got more complex measurements and more complex observations. So that is the what matters statement 1. And what I'm going to do now is I'm going to go through as many ideas as I can to help you to teach that scientific process through using the outdoors as a resource. Now, in case you're thinking about outdoor learning versus learning outside, what we're trying to do in outdoor learning is use the outdoors as a resource to teach. So we are not just taking an experiment that we do inside and moving it outside. we're trying to find something in the outdoors that we can use as a resource to actually teach the process. So that's the difference. So we're going to start with progression step 1, thinking about your continuous provision. In your continuous provision, you are trying to get your learners to explore and ask questions. So it's really easy to include this in your continuous provision. And the way to do that is to include items such as water pumps, water wheels, and also magnifying glasses, and anything for looking for greater detail in mini beasts, marble type runs, like this girl on the wall on the top left here. And then looking at motion, cars, obviously, but also ramps, selections of materials. So different things like rubber, perspex, metal, wooden, fabric. And then, of course, with your construction, if you include in your construction set different types of materials like boxes or corrugated cardboard, crates, toilet rolls, tubes, newspaper. And of course, the important thing is the challenge that you set with these items in your mind, okay? So it's really important to provide the materials and the equipment which are not restrictive in the way that you can put them together or use them. So we're pushing this exploring and how things work. So we've got to make sure that it's not obvious how it works, and it's also should be a piece of equipment or a piece of material that is not only used in one way. So you set it up, you put the ball in, done. That's it, end of learning. So really, we want items that allow for them to trial, get it wrong, not work, revisit it, try and change it, and they're always asking questions and always exploring. So we need to allow for experimentation in all that they play with, so that it's not immediately obvious what the item is used for. So thinking about things like water walls and marble runs, if you've got one that is static, then it is very restrictive as to what they can do. Once they've poured water in the top or put a marble in the top and it's gone all the way down, really what questions are they going to ask? Unless you've got a question, a TA there next to them, or a way of providing them with explorative questions, then chances are they're just going to sit and repeat the same thing over and over, and they're not actually learning much. So try and make any walls that you've got, either water walls or marble runs, manipulative, so they can change the angles. They're not stuck in one way. But the real observation and the communication of the What Matters Statement 1, talking about that inquiry, is actually comes from the intervention of your teacher or your TA in asking these pertinent questions. And really, there's nothing that can replace that. So it's really important that you have a good plan to develop a set of questions for your staff who are working outside with your learners, so that they can ask through this continuous provision stations and force the learners to make observations and communicate their ideas. So this could be just some sentence starters, but you could also come up with a little pack to give to your TAs to prompt them to ask the right questions, to get the learners to ask a questioning about the activity they're doing. So like if we're looking at using balls or using water or any of those pictures on the previous slide, you can ask them things like, why do you think that it moves like that? And then trying to get them questioning as well. Then you can start to get them thinking about methodologies. Of course, you're not going to ask them to write a method or do a method. But if you ask them the right question, then you start getting them into that scientific frame of mind to start thinking about the process. So like, which material do you think would be the best for building a bridge or making a hat? And again, you can question their theory of why that's a good idea, looking at their knowledge base as well. You can also think about what happens next. So we'll think about prediction, prompting ideas of predicting before it happens. And then when you change things, if you put some more weight on, what do you think is going to happen next? And then analyzing it. Why do you think that worked? Why didn't it work? And then what can we do to make it better? So evaluating as well. Then thinking about the resource use, the equipment use, especially if you've got boxes of equipment that are available for them to use and move into different places, then you can ask, well, what's the best piece of equipment for this? What do you need to make this work? What do you need to make this better? And you can also start to evaluate what happened and say, right, okay, we're going to move on to, you've had a question, you've answered it. Let's move on to the next question by evaluating, by asking, well, what could we do to make it go faster? Let's try and make it faster. Let's try and make it slower. And then you start, hopefully, if you've got the inquiry process right, you should answer one question, but it leads you to a new question that will then bring you round with the next one. So it's an onward spiral. You don't end up ever coming to the end. Oh, I found out everything. It's never going to get to that point. And then, of course, you've got those conclusions and those analysing, these higher level skills, which are more for the progression step 2 and 3. But there's no reason why you can ask them. So what does that make you wonder? What did you find out? What do you think? Why do you think? And again, it's not about the right answer. It's getting them thinking about what's going on and why. And it really doesn't matter what their answer is, as long as they are thinking it through. So most of the key content of the Science and Technology AOLE can actually be taught through the scientific inquiry process. So this is really helpful because it not only allows you to cover the content, but you also, every time you do this, you're embedding this scientific process at the same time. So what I'm going to do to help you with this is I'm going to describe a number of scientific inquiries that you could undertake that cover the majority of the content of the AOLE. So I'm going to go through the requirements of the scientific method. So what you need to do in terms of the title, the variables, the method, the equipment, if it's relevant, the results you might expect. And then I'm also going to show you how you can differentiate for the different progression steps. So how you can undertake it for progression step 1, and then how you can make it more difficult for progression step 3 and 4. So hopefully then, if you're undertaking the investigation, it doesn't really matter where your learners are. If you've got learners who are in progression step 1 or 3, this same investigation can be undertaken, but slightly modified, and all progression steps can actually be covered. So you're supporting your learners, or you're actually extending the ones that need extending. So starting with living things, this is one of the contents of the key considerations. So if we're looking at plants to start with, so do seeds need soil, light or water to sprout? So we're thinking about the variables we need for plants to grow. And we're talking about seeds now, not plants as they are. So planting the seeds in different soil, and obviously without soil as a comparison, putting it on tissue paper, putting them in water, putting them in light, putting them in dark, and then just counting how many seeds actually do sprout. And this is something obviously is going to take time, but it's quite a good one because you assume that when you put seeds in water with soil, they're going to sprout. And whereas if they don't have any soil and they don't have any water, they probably won't sprout. But in fact, soil is not needed for seeds, because if you dissect them, you'll find that they've got their own food. So I find it's a really positive thing if you find an investigation where the answer is not what the students expect, or they don't know the answer yet, because then they'll actually learn something new. It really frustrates me going into schools and you go into the year 6 class and you ask them the question, oh, why do penguins huddle? And they tell you. And then you do an experiment, and then they found out they were right. And what did they learn? So thinking of a question you don't know the answer to is a much better scientific way of working than giving them an inquiry question that they know the answer to already, and then just going through the motions. Also with habitats, again, unpredictable results. Mini beasts, yes. Which mini beast habitats do they prefer? So we can predict where we think we'll find the most. And again, you do that depending on what your school grounds have got. You don't need brilliant woodlands. You can have underneath benches compared to on the grass, or just on the concrete or the tarmac, underneath the shadow of the building. Doesn't have to have great grounds to do these. And finding them, again, the equipment you need. You don't need lots of really expensive equipment. Little pots, dustpan and brush is great for brushing off plants. And then looking at sheets, if you shake trees, the animals will fall down onto the sheet, and you can see the animals there. Moving more into mini beasts as well, if you've actually caught some of those mini beasts, you can actually do some measurements on the mini beasts, apart from obviously being careful with them. But we can start to look at if the ones with the most legs run the fastest. I've done a lovely project with the Olympics, and we actually had races. And if you have a pond, it's great because you can do backstroke versus front stroke. So you can have a lesser water boatman and a greater water boatman who swim on the back and the front, and then you can race them along. And again, great measurements that you're going to be taking for speed and length as well. You can then also relate that to your own health, because that is also part of What Matters Statement 3, looking at what their bodies. So we're looking again for variation in height or variation in leg length, variation in all over the children, and seeing if there's a relationship between our height and whether they run the fastest. So you can compare that to the same with mini beasts, to mini beasts with the longest legs run the farthest, ones with the longest legs jump the highest. So much you can do to compare your animals to yourselves as well. Moving on to more of the material side, so the What Matters Statement 4, we can think about the materials that you've got in your school grounds, and you can actually create some materials to see which one is the strongest. You can build some materials. This links really well with topics if you're doing humanities topic with history, looking at houses in the past, and also looking at houses of the future. You can also use it to look at design, the What Matters Statement 2, which we'll talk about later. So if you're looking at which material is the strongest, really good emphasis on how we undertake a good method, which is a fair test. Is how can we make sure that our building is the same as the other building, so it's not an unfair test. And then you can use different materials. If you've got older children, you can actually make concrete using different proportions of sand, concrete mix and shale or chippings. If for younger ones, it just can be almost using the story of the Three Little Pigs, and you can measure the strength of the straw and the stick and the house made out of bricks. So how we differentiate this, I haven't put in progression step 1 because of course they're not actually undertaking the inquiry process, they're just exploring and asking questions. So I wouldn't expect them to go through the whole process. But for the other progression steps, we can just see with progression step 2, just trying to draw some pictograms to compare the conditions to the one that sprouted the most or sprouted the least or didn't sprout at all. So we can do some basic pictograms. When we get onto the progression step 3, we can start to draw our bar charts to look at the conditions against how long it took to actually germinate or how many of our seeds germinate. And then in progression step 4, we're trying to make some sense of this. So you can start to dissect your seed to look for that source of food so that the ones without soil or food can still grow. Where is that source located in the seed? With mini beasts, again, opportunities to draw bar graphs when you're in progression step 2, especially on J2E, looking at the locations and then the number of mini beasts. For progression step 3, we can move into line graphs when we're thinking about choice chambers. Now, choice chambers is a structure that you create, which has got different environments in different chambers, all connected to each other. So you'll have a wet, dark area, and a wet, dry area, a wet, light area, and a dry, dark area, and a dry, dark, light area. And then you'll see mini beasts, woodlouse work best with this, which one they actually all congregate into. And then you can look at those in terms of line graphs, so how wet was it and how dry was it. And again, when you're going on to progression step 4, we can start to use this information to design a new experiment to include more different habitats, because you've only got 4 habitats there, but of course they've got the choice of the whole area. And if you've got a lot of people, especially when you're designing something or you want to do something to conserve mini beasts in your school grounds, you're creating mini beast houses, which is fantastic. But then once they're grown, it's almost, once they've been made, it's like, well, that's it, we've made it, that's it, end of learning. But in fact, this is an opportunity for you to do a science investigation into how effective your mini beast house was. So if you actually were monitoring and sampling the animals that were visiting and moving in and staying in your mini beast house, you can actually work out which one is the best and which one is the most effective in providing the conditions it's required for those mini beasts by analysing which ones are there, the biodiversity, the numbers, the types, and over time you can see how that changes as well. So loads of data analysis require opportunities there. Sticking with the mini beast then, again, if you're just looking at which one crawls the fastest, we're looking at bar charts. But then if you're thinking about our continuous data, so continuous data is data you can put on a line from 0 to a higher number, and there's an obvious relationship there. If you do that with numbers of legs against speed, then we can start to see if there's a correlation between those two variables. So as the number of legs goes up, do the mini beasts actually move faster? And then progression step 4 would allow you to predict what would happen next. So if you found that you've got your 8-legged animal, so your spider was running the fastest, how fast would you predict a woodlouse to go, which has 12 legs? So you can actually use a graph to actually extrapolate that. With the oldest child and the tallest, we can also look for that variation. We can see if there's a relationship between the age. And also it's a great one to look for anomalies. And if there's no pattern to our results, why is that? So we're actually evaluating now our method. What's wrong with the method we used? Is anything wrong with it? Or is it just that the relationship doesn't exist? And also how we can improve our investigation to make it more scientific and less biased and get rid of some of those anomalies. And very similar for the mini beast and jumping and running the furthest. We can do bar graphs for just looking at shortest, longest, and then for progression step 3, moving on to line graphs to see if there is a relationship between the leg length and the speed and the height they're running. And again, for progression step 4 or even progression step 3, we can use that information to inform us as to what we can do next. So that's a really important part of the What Matters statement, is using this information in an unfamiliar environment. And so using that data, you can say, right, okay, based on that, who should we use to run the race at Sports Day, do the jumping competition? And so using that in different form and seeing the practicalities of your results and why it might be useful is really important. In terms of the building material, if you're going to, as I said, with progression step 2, you're probably doing it around a story and giving them the range of materials. They might just want to video it, because the problem with building this is that you might be creating qualitative data, and qualitative data is data without numbers, and it's very hard to actually present that type of data. Very important type of data, but difficult to present it. So videoing it and just doing an annotation or just talking about it, that would be enough for that. For progression step 3, you can get them to start thinking about how they're going to measure it. If we want to know which one is the strongest, but which one is the second strongest, how could we measure? So thinking about methods that you can use to measure strength, and you could bring in force meters then, but also you could just think about ways in using weight and see which one is destroyed, think about timings as well, and relating it to the properties of material, and then looking around your school grounds and seeing if properties are related to the materials that are used and whether it relates to the answers that you found undertaking the investigation. Next lot of scientific inquiries, we're sticking in that What Matters statement 4, looking at the chemistry really. So what colours are the warmest? Now, this is something that we could do at all times of year, but works best in the summer. All you have to do is find some different colours in your school grounds, and then you can either just touch them and see which one is the warmest, or you can use a strip thermometer, or if you've got really hot weather, you can use ice cubes and see which one melts the farthest. So you don't need much, you do need time, it takes a while, and then the results you'll find, the darker the colour, the more the light is absorbed, the hotter it is, and then the quicker your ice cube will melt. With materials, you can also look at their decomposition, so looking at sustainability, seeing which one decomposes fastest. Now, if the previous investigation takes a while, this one takes even longer, so this one's taking weeks, but you can set it up, and it's a really good way of embedding fair testing into your scientific inquiry, because you've got to bury the same size of the material, but is it the weight or is it the size in area? So the materials you can use kitchen roll, you can use paper, you can use cardboard, and I like to put in laminated paper, not plastic, just laminated paper. So again, they all look the same, and then need somewhere where you can bury them, again, same distance of depth, and then see what happens after a certain length of time. Which material reflects the most heat? Again, in the summer, building solar ovens is a great way of investigating reflection of heat. So we're looking at the light now and temperature, and you can measure with a thermometer inside a solar oven, or you could put something in there that will melt as it gets hotter. Chocolate works well, and ice as well. Sticking with the conversion, moving on to the conversion of energy, looking at temperature again, but where is the warmest place in your school grounds? Again, you could just go around with the strip thermometers, but you can also buy ground thermometers, which are really cheap. You can place them in different locations and measure, and you can almost map the heat around your school grounds, and you could actually put that onto a map as well. How can we generate the most energy? So this is looking at renewable energy resources. So you're trying to gather energy from your school grounds, and you're identifying that as an energy source. So we've got solar energy, we've got wind energy, and you might even have biomass. So thinking about where you might put wind turbines, where you might collect the sun, where's the best place on the roof, and taking some measurements to actually support that decision is really important in this investigation. Moving on to waves now. So which sound travels the furthest? Very simply, you just line up the students away from a tape measure. So they're at one end, and then one student at the other end of the tape measure makes different sounds, and depending on the pitch, they see which one travels the furthest. You can use decibel meters to measure noise, but it won't measure pitch. But if you want to measure pitch, you just need a musical instrument, and the higher the pitch, you'll see the higher pitches don't actually move very far, but the higher ones are not absorbed. So the low pitches are going to actually travel furthest. So for differentiation, with the colors and the warmest, you're just literally holding against things and just saying which one's warmer, which one's cooler. When we get to progression step 3, we're trying to produce some continuous data. So we're going to actually get some locational data, which we can put on a continuous line. So that would be a distance from something. So it could be a distance from a building, or it could be a distance from the blackbet, and then we can measure the temperature away from that. And then again, you can use this information when we get to progression step 4 to identify what color we should make our solar panels, and where they'll absorb the most heat. With the decomposition, on progression step 2, you're really concentrating on their experience of the material. So you're thinking about, well, have they seen this around, like in terms of litter? You know, do you see tissue paper and cardboard flowing around in the wind, or is it mainly the plastics? And then for progression step 3 and 4, you're getting them to choose materials, but again, trying to focus in on that fair testing. How do you make sure they're the same amount? And thinking about relating it to a dissimilar situation. So you want to bury a time capsule based on your data. What material should you make it out of? You want to destroy some evidence from a crime scene because you don't want anyone to find it. What material would you wrap that in? With your solar ovens, with progression step 2, you'll show them it, you'll actually give them it. But in progression step 3, we can merge this with what matters statement 2, the design process, and we can get them to design a solar oven and use the right material that reflects the most heat to actually create it. And we can also look at creating some graphs against materials and how fast it takes for things to melt using materials as your discrete data, so your categorical data along the bottom for bar graphs. And then for progression step 4, nice way of building in some humanities there is thinking about countries that actually use the sun for cooking things, and they could design a way of cooking food using the sun's energy by looking at their design of their solar oven. With the warmest place in the school, as I said, looking at symbols as ways of creating quantitative data. So you're looking at, it's going to be cold, so we've got snowman, hot, it's a fire. That's for our progression step 2. Then we go to progression step 3. We're looking at more quantitative data, so collecting data using strip thermometers or thermometers, and then you can put bar graphs over location. When we get to progression step 4, or even upper key stage 2, you can then turn that discrete data into some continuous data by looking at distance from something. So as we get further away from the woods, as we get further away from the school, how does the temperature change? And looking for patterns. And that's a great opportunity to do a scatter graph look for relationships between our ground source. So is it a black surface, or is it a surface with soil on it, and seeing how that affects the temperature. Generating the energy, for progression step 2, you can just use windmills going around your school grounds to see which part is windiest. You can relate that. If you don't want to do energy, you can use that to relate to things like, well, where should we fly our kites? Where should we have a picnic? With the progression steps 3 and 4, then you can try and get them to actually identify the location by mapping where the energy would be. So what's the wind speed in different areas? And then you could experiment with orientating your wind meter. Wind meters really cheap. You can get them online for a few pounds. And if you've got a wind, just anything that will actually generate wind by, will collect wind by going around like a windmill, you can actually put on a little bit of tape, and then every time it goes round, it will just click. So you can count the clicks as well. And you can experiment with orientating it. Which direction do you get the most wind? And also lifting up high. Is there a relationship between height above ground and the wind speed as well? With the speed, again, just very simply listening to the sounds and seeing which one they hear. And then with progression step 3 and 4, we need to experiment with different instruments, different frequencies, different pitches. And you could also try and see if there's a way in which we can use that information. So thinking about the cars going past, which cars are actually producing the most sound, and is that sound actually getting to the houses nearby or to the school, so it's actually causing a nuisance. So how could we actually make them quieter by changing their pitch? We can also do a lovely experiment with waves. There is lots of ways in which you can measure waves, either sound waves or light waves. And again, does not require expensive equipment. So sound waves, using a decibel meter, which is downloadable from onto an iPad, which is free, you can look at what materials block sound. You could do this on a small scale, or you could do barriers that you've actually got in school. So if you think about what noise sources you've got, you might have a road, you could have a place where you're behind a fence or behind a hedge or behind nothing, and you can measure the different sound readings and noise readings as you go to those locations. Or you could go to somewhere that's noisy in your school grounds, like one side of the wall or the other side of the wall. Other waves, we can look at UV as well, and we can look at heat. So in space, of course, nice one, which is a slight variation on the penguin one. Which material will keep you warm in space? So again, we're looking at insulation, and they choose their materials. But what you're trying to do is you're going to take something warm, so a warm bit of water that is room and that is body temperature, take that outside, and you use natural materials to try and keep that warm. And you're placing it outside, and you're going to take the temperature of it every few minutes. And again, it's just, you know, them using the natural materials to actually create. And a good, I'll talk about that when we go on to the progression steps. And then the last one is looking at UV. You can get some really nice UV beads that change color depending on the amount of UV they're exposed to. So they've got a spectrum, they go more and more purple. And just taking those out and measuring them in different parts of your school grounds, you can end up with some nice data for that as well. So in order to differentiate for this, blocking sound, we can just do echoes. We can just shout nearer or closer away from buildings or hedges and fences and see what happens. And for progression step 3 and 4, we are looking at how the sound is blocking it. So if we've got an impermeable barrier, so that is something that doesn't let anything through, so that would be a wall or a fence, what happens to the sound? Does it reflect it straight back, or does it allow some of it through? And then in progression step 4, we can also think about how that sound moves around. And as you get closer to the barrier, you can see how that sound reduces by using your actual decibel meter to measure it. With the materials, we're going to be looking at data presentation. So we've got the bar graphs, looking at which material keeps it the longest. Progression step 3, we can do the same with the bar graph, but we're doing or we could do it temperature drop over time to get a nice scatter graph. And then we can use that to rank the materials by the best insulator. And a good way of doing this about keeping you warm in space, you can also move this into your school grounds and thinking about, right, obviously I'm not in space here, but I could use this to determine how to keep myself warm. So we could use the materials that we might use for our clothes to put around these items to see which one is the best to keep us warm as well. Or you can think about you moving into using it to design a spacesuit. Then the materials blocking the UV, again, this leads into designing aspects of spacesuits. So the visor for astronauts, you want to block all the UV. So trying to work out which material will block the UV by taking those UV beads outside and then putting different colored materials over the top to see which one stops those UV beads changing color. And then it could be that different colored materials work, or different types of materials work. So it gives you a lot to work with in terms of your method and also your variables. Okay, and then the last one, these are inquiries that you could do looking at that other aspect of the What Matters Statement 1, which is the environment, the impact on the environment. So every school grounds who's got grass usually has a part of it which is very badly trampled. Could be you have a way where people walk through that bit, or it could be that you've got a goalpost with a big trampled barrier in the middle. So in doing this investigation, we're going to see what the effect of trampling has on plants. So you need to measure the amount of trampling, and then you're going to measure either the density of plants, the height of plants, or it could be how they're growing. And all you need to do is you could do a transect, so you could draw a line across your goalposts and map out where the plants are and see that the plants are not where the middle of the goalposts are. But you could also measure the compaction of the soil to see if that's affecting it. And to measure compaction of the soil, you just drop a knitting needle and it will dig into the ground. And the more it digs in, the less compact the soil is. And the data that you've got then can be used either to just almost say if there is the presence or not of plants. So progression step 2, you're just seeing, yes, there's plants, no, there isn't. Progression step 3, we can draw some line graphs showing how the height of plant changes with distance across the trampled area. And then with progression step 4, we can look at the form of those plants to see how they're growing, the ones that survive, the ones that are actually growing there. How are they surviving? Are they growing closer to the ground, or are they growing taller? So we're looking at reasons for the relationship that we find. Some other investigations that you can do for looking at the impact of the environment are ones that are, well, cover the inquiry process, but are specifically aimed at looking at the impact on the environment. So we can undertake a survey to see if your school grounds is sustainable or unsustainable. So that's looking at what materials are being used in your school grounds, anything that's being replaced quite often, that's being destroyed, that's not lasting, that's causing pollution, either by land pollution or air pollution. We could also look at the materials that have not decomposed if you've got a compost heap. So compost heaps are fantastic for looking through, obviously, lots of science. But if you can find things, and there's always odd bit of rubbish there, you can almost dig down to find out how long it's been there to work out and map the journey of it. So litter going around your school grounds, how did it get there and how did it stay there? And based on that, you can decide where to put any litter bins. And then last of all, designing school improvements for all your living things. So these are big projects now based on all that information that you've got for your inquiries about mini beasts and what they like and where they like to live. You could then say, right, okay, based on that, what should we actually build in our school grounds to improve the life of all the living things? And it doesn't have to be huge. You don't have to have a pond. You could just have a big pile of rocks, and that's great for reptiles. A pile of sticks, that's also great for reptiles. Planting flowers for pollinators. And if you survey before you do that, before you make those improvements, then afterwards, then you can see how your biodiversity has increased. And that is the What Matters Statement 1 science inquiry process. Does anybody have any questions while I stop for a drink? Feel free to either unmute or to put it in the chat. No? Okay, fantastic. Now that is the longest of the What Matters statements that I'm going to be going through today. So don't worry, we're not going to be going through it in so much detail with all the others, because I've covered an awful lot of the What Matters statements anyway, because it's the content. So What Matters Statement 2, if you think about What Matters Statement 1 as being the scientific inquiry process, then What Matters Statement 2 is the design process. It's the technology equivalent of that. Now, this process is you're probably less aware of this, because it really was part of the Key Stage 3 and Key Stage 4 DT curriculum. So it's quite different to what we've really done in primary before. But what it covers really is what we call the design process. So this is the design process here. And the design process requires you to think about the product and what problem you're actually trying to get around. So the design brief, as we call it. So, and then you communicate the ideas of that design brief. They then have to think about this user-centered design. So based on that design brief, they have to identify what's important, research to find some possible solutions, and thinking about the point of view of the customer to actually make the product. Then they've got to think about things like the materials they're going to use. And there's so many considerations within that. It could be that you're looking at environmental impact and also the sustainability and also how long it's going to last. The components, how you're going to get the components to stick together. So you might have to create some skills or learn some skills in order to do that. And then you're going to generate ideas. So you need to come up with some ideas on how you're going to build this product and what it's going to include. Then, as opposed to the inquiry process for the What Matters Statement 1, we don't go testing yet. We actually produce something, we prototype it. So you're using tools and some skills to create a prototype. And then it won't be perfect. So you test it. And then when it doesn't work, you refine it. And you keep doing that until your prototype is great. And then you communicate that and you get feedback from the customer. And that sends you back to your prototype and changing it and testing it. And you've got this renew cycle that you carry on. So that is the design process. So I'm going to go through some ideas. This is one idea of how to include every aspect of the design process in an activity that you've probably all done. So I'm just going to do this one, and then I will give you loads of ideas of how to design lots of other things. So we're just going to focus on designing a den, so den building. So a progression step 1, you're going to try and make it quite low key and quite simplistic. So you challenge them with a design brief of, can you build a shelter for a puppet? Okay, so you've got some parameters there, but very limited parameters, so they can design and test, and if it falls down, they have to rebuild it. So they're kind of going through the process, but it's not very, very structured. Progression step 2, you're all increasing the challenge by providing a real specific context. So can you design a shelter that will keep you dry from the rain? So you've got something that you can test at the end, and if it doesn't work, they can then redesign and then test it again. When we get to progression step 3, we can still carry on with the same idea of building a den, but we're going to be obviously adding in more of those stages from the design process. So we need to get them to research how they're going to make a den which is suitable for the climate that fits us. So they need to consider the materials, how they're going to use them, the properties of those materials, and what makes them suitable for the role they're going to play in this den. Maybe they could use tools to construct it, so they need to learn the skills of safe tool use. You can test that design by seeing if they fit inside it. They can also see if it's weatherproof by testing it, by pouring water on it. They need the opportunity to refine their design, to improve it. So it's important to not just say, right, you've done it, we've finished. It's like, no, we need to analyze it, refine it. How can we make it better? Retest it. Because really the first den they built is their prototype. Then they need the opportunity to present their ideas and communicate their design to other people. So I like taking them round to each other's design, and each group that's made that design are up front and they're explaining how they built it, how it works, what makes it meet the design brief. And then you have the rest of the class asking them questions, giving them feedback, and also finding out the answers to the design brief and making sure it meets them. And then you can identify how the den will solve the problem of sheltering. So they've got to say how it's effective to do its job. And then responding to that feedback by either saying, yes, we've done that, this is how we've done it, or, oh no, I need to redesign to actually make sure that's better. That's a great idea, I'll follow that through. Then when we get to progression step 4, we're prioritizing what factors will inform your design, because when you've got that design brief, it may not be possible to cover all of them. So you need to prioritize. And then they're using prototyping techniques to test the idea. So they might do that by creating a scale model of the den and then going out and building it once they've tested some small scale designs. And then they want to improve the functionality of the den by evaluating it. So thinking about how they combined their component parts. So lashing is a great way of using some simple skills to get things to stick together and still tests their ability to persevere, because it's quite tricky. But they can also think about changing the material. So how they're going to make it stronger, how they're going to make it resist the wind and more waterproof. And they really need opportunities to evaluate the intent and identify responsible habitat working. So how are they going to minimize the impact on the environment of their den? So thinking about the materials they've used, thinking about how it's going to go back into the environment when they've left it. So that is the process of the design process. So this same process can be used to undertake a huge number of design activities outside, and they can link into so many different topics that you do across curricula. So here's just a few that I've done that work well. So designing roller coasters using the landscape outside. So I use foam insulation that you can get from B&Q, and you can put marbles and they go run down it perfectly, but using the landscape to create it. And of course, your design brief will say things like, we want the fastest roller coaster or the slowest roller coaster or the one with the most loops or the longest. So you need to use that design brief to either reduce or increase your amount of challenge. Designing and building a cable car system around your school grounds. Again, lots of design problems here and solutions they need to come up with. Obviously, things like going uphill, and also you can vary it depending on how much of the school ground you want to cover. Building an obstacle course or playground. Again, you might want to do this on a small scale in a model situation, or you might actually want them to use the school grounds to recreate some obstacles that they've seen using their prior knowledge. Solar systems. Lots of people use the outdoors because it's a great big space, but you can use it to look at scale. So using it to mirror the scale between the different planets. But again, thinking about the problem solving aspect, that's what you want them to focus on, not just let's just build it so it looks nice. We want to make sure that it's the right scale compared to the real planet distances. Windbreaks and sound barriers. If you've done investigations looking at where the noisiest area is, or the road that's creating problems, or the nursery yard that's disturbing the year sixes, thinking about designing a windbreak or a sound break so that you don't have that noise from the chickens or from the nursery or from the road, so they can test that and then they can start to build it as well. Then we can get to some really big ones, some increasingly challenging concepts like redesigning your whole school grounds or anything within your school grounds and the aspects in which you want to focus on. You could do it on health and well-being. So we want to improve movement around the school grounds and physical play, or we want to increase our mental well-being. So how can we design it? So again, your brief will be based on what other aspects of the curriculum you want to cover. Siege machines or irrigation systems. If you've got veg patches, or if you've got an allotment area, usually it's quite away from your watering system. So designing an irrigation system is actually a really useful thing to do, but it gives them a project that needs to think about a lot of science, but also following the design method to do that. Siege machines, like this one on the right, this trebuchet. If you're doing siege machines in your humanities, then you can build trebuchets, ballistas, catapults, and then the actual building of them, you use the design phase to actually undertake. So you've got to prototype it, build it, think about the skills, the materials, but also you can then do a scientific inquiry into which siege machine throws the material the furthest. So I use either marshmallows or Mentos, and then you can then do a bit of a science investigation on the product you've made as well. Model houses, I get students to make model houses depending on which aspect of history they are doing in humanities. So you can do Celtic round houses, doing wattle and daub, medieval long houses, again using wattle and daub, Tudor half tree houses, Roman villas. So the design aspect of it is not all their imagination. They're using their knowledge of either research or looking at other, if you've got a field trip to one of these old reenacted villages, then you can use that to create your own model size one. And then again, moving on to some more practical ones is designing an extension for your school. That's quite a tricky thing to do, but there's an awful lot of maths that comes in there, which is great if you want to bring in some numeracy. Okay, that's What Matters Statement 2. Any questions on that one? A bit shorter. Okay, fantastic. Right, moving on to What Matters Statement 3. So this is all about plants and animals and the world around us and living things. So we're looking at habitats, life cycles, competition, reproduction, ecosystems, and our body. And this is probably the easiest and most obvious What Matters statement to teach outside. So if any of the aspects of the What Matters statement you're doing outside, it's probably this one. So I'm going to go through some ideas, not in too much detail, because I'm not going to try and tell you ones that you're probably doing already. I'm going to try and give you things that you may not have come up with. So progression step 1, we're talking about sorting. So thinking about living and non-living things. So looking at your school grounds and surveying and just identifying what is alive and what isn't is quite an important thing for them to start with, really. Then we get to progression step 2. We're actually trying to find these mini beasts and animals that are in your school grounds. So if you've got different habitats, if you've got ponds, if you've got grass, then obviously you can do pond dipping. You can also do sweep netting. So this picture in the middle here is of sweep netting. Sweep nets are a bit different from pond nets, and they've got a mesh that's much tighter. But if you sweep through any long grass, especially in the summer, you get loads of grasshoppers and things. So it's a great way of collecting mini beasts. At the top here, this is tree beating. Again, for that, all you need is a sheet and a tree that you can reach a big branch from. So you just have to get your students to hold the sheet out and keep it nice and still. That's the hardest bit because they want to shake it. And then you have to be able to shake a branch over their heads. Just make sure they've got hoods up because branches do fall down, and just risk assess before you do it. So shake the branch, and then the animals that are holding onto the leaves at the top of the tree will fall down into onto the material that we've got there. So any one of those that you can find, you can start to create some data collection. And then what's a really good idea is every time you do any mini beast hunts and you collect any data, you keep that data as a spreadsheet as a resource. So you can see over time, or even over the different seasons, how the variety of animals changes. So if you're keeping, every time somebody does a mini beast, we write it down and we keep it on that database, we keep it on the T drive. And it means that you can then do some really good graphs, especially with the year 6s, seeing how it changes either over the year or over the years. And you can see any kind of relationship there. Life cycles, again, if you're going to be looking at mini beasts, a really good idea is linking in, especially with progression step 1, is to link into the book Monkey Puzzle by Julia Donaldson. I don't know if you've read that, but it's a fantastic book all about a monkey talking to a butterfly and saying he's lost his mum and he wants to find her. And they go around going to all these animals, and the butterfly goes, well, is this your mum? And the monkey's like, well, of course it's not my mum. And it's just to identify the fact that if life cycles have got more than one phase, then their mums and their babies look very different from each other. Now, obviously, you can actually collect these mini beasts and you can keep them and watch them metamorphose. And lots of people have done this with buying in caterpillars, but and also getting in tadpoles. But there's a bit more that you can do from that, apart from just watching it, observing, and maybe taking some pictures and drawing it. If you've got them, if you can take them outside, that's really good, because obviously they're much more happy there, especially if you've got a tank. If you've got a tank with tadpoles in, they will much prefer it outside. They get very warm and they actually die when they get too hot. So keeping them outside is better than keeping them inside. And thinking about when they're outside, talking about feeding relationships. So we can think about where in your school grounds we might find these naturally. And we can also revisit them to see if they've pupated. So you can leave them out there, come back and visit them. If they're in your classroom, it's almost like, oh yeah, they're still there. So it's nice to go out to their environment and to see them and see how they've changed. So if you've got a pond, great. But if you haven't, it doesn't have to be large. Literally, a washing up bowl just dug into the ground, add a few stones and the water plants, and leave it, and it will be populated. And if it's not populated by tadpoles, then you might find other animals. So ones which are great for doing life cycles are dragonflies, stoneflies, midges. All of these animals have got a aquatic nymphal stage, so an aquatic child stage, and then they turn into an adult flying stage. So don't think, oh, I've got to do tadpoles, I've got to do butterflies. There are other ones that you can do. You also do ladybirds. Ladybird larvae look nothing like ladybirds, so very good one to use as well. I've actually, on my YouTube channel, I've got a video on how to make a pond just with a washing up bowl. So if you are thinking, oh, we could do this year, but we haven't got a pond, you can literally quickly bury it now. And if you've got some plants in there, give it time and you can watch the animals actually start to colonize it. You can also look at feeding relationships and the relationships with living things and their habitats. So if you're setting up a new environment, a new habitat for these animals, then you really need to be aware of what they need to include. So you need to know what they like, so what substrate they need, how they're going to move, where they're going to shelter, what they're going to hide from. So we're looking at predator-prey relationships. We can also look at ways in which we can protect it from predators. So really simple ones, pond, maybe a bit more effort, but just a pile of rocks, that's great for observing reptiles. If you've got rocks hanging around, put it on a sunny place, and then over time in the summer or just before, then reptiles will probably move in there and you can observe them. You can also do it with flowers as well. So if you want to encourage pollinators, then just planting flower beds, especially if you've got different colours flowers, you can actually do a science investigation to see which colour flower pollinators prefer. So you can plant all different colours, and then you can sit there and watch and tally off which pollinators are going to which colour flower. And so you've increased the amount of mini bees coming to your school grounds by adding those pollen-filled plants as well. Also things like leaf litter, so a big pile of leaf litter, almost like a compost heap, then you can see the decomposers moving in. So your worms, your slugs, your woodlouse, you can see them starting to come in. If you're lucky, some hedgehogs. And you can see, again, what do they like about this habitat? So it's really good that you're actually making the best use of the habitats that you're creating. So if you've made these homes, then come back to them over again and just look and see what's moved in, what's changed. You can even measure the conditions. You know, is it getting warmer? Is it getting colder? Is it getting wetter? And it means that the learners can investigate the needs of the mini beasts, and it will influence the designs that they've got. So if you've built a mini beast house and we only had a few, maybe we can adapt it following progression step what matters statement 2, the design process, to create a new house that we think would be even better or more specifically for a certain species of mini beast. Food chains, again, if you've got any habitats in your school grounds that you can collect the animals from, we can start to think about feeding relationships there. So identifying which ones are herbivores, which are carnivores, which one eats which. You can start to look at some food chains and some food webs. You can also think about animals visiting your grounds that you won't be able to catch. So bird watching, if you've got binoculars, or you can see them coming to your feeder. What are they taking? You can also look at things like robins and see if what they've actually got in their beaks. If you've got nests in your school grounds, observing them and seeing how often the birds visit with food, you can start to get the idea of how much food is required to keep a baby bird fed. You can also survey the mammals in your school grounds. Now, I don't mean collecting them, I mean getting evidence that they're there. So you can create mammal tubes. All you need for that is a kitchen roll. If you've got an ink pad, you can put an ink pad at the end of it, put some food in the middle, put double-sided sticky tape on the inside at the top. And then what happens is your mammal, as long as it's bigger than the tube, so the inside of cling film is actually better because most mammals will have to push to get through there. As they push to get into the tube to get the food, their fur will hit against the double-sided sticky tape and it will just take out a few of the hairs, And as they walk past your ink pad, they will step on that and create some lovely footprints. Or you can put flour outside, and then when they walk on that, they make footprints as well. And then you can analyze that to find out what mammals you have living in your school grounds. So with all of that information, you could build up a database of the animals living or visiting your school ground. You could even create an identification guide, because there are loads of identification guides out there for plants and animals, but chances are they won't be the appropriate ones for your school grounds. So if you use that information you've got to build a database and then build an ID guide, so the ID guide of plants and animals in such and such a school grounds, if you give that to your learners in nursery reception, when they go round trying to look for them, they will be there so they can tick them off. It's quite frustrating taking an ID guide round to look for all these things and actually they don't exist in your school grounds. So, and again, that feeds into this curriculum for your learners. So making your bespoke curriculum, making your bespoke resources. And if your year sixes are making the resource that you can then use with your lower school, then you don't have to make it. Oh, I don't. Okay, so sticking with the plants and animals, the aspects that we need to cover are adaptation, independence, and structure. So we're looking at our plants and our animals. So adaptation, great way is looking at those mini beasts in great detail by sketching and annotating them. How are they adapted to live in those environments? And then using that to design a mini beast for a new environment. How would it move? What's it got? What color would it be? How would it feed? How would it protect itself? And then looking at ways in which other animals protect themselves by camouflaging them. So you can think about colors that you can spot in the environment and which are the hardest to spot. Also observing the way the animals move. Good way of doing that. If you get see-through plastic, I got see-through clipboards, put the animals on top of it and then put it above your head. If you lie down, it's a lot easier because then it's still flat. You can watch how these animals move. Slugs, snails, worms are brilliant to watch underneath because you can see how the muscles are moving backwards and forwards. They're stunning to watch from underneath. You can also observe things like swimming animals. So if you've got trays, you can watch them swimming. How are they using their arms? Things like water boatment with those huge long oars that they've evolved. Some fantastic movement there, but also lots of the other ones are just running along the surface or ones that are running along the ground. So again, trying to see how they're adapted to move. And then you can investigate mini beast adaptation in different animals, so in different environments. So go to one habitat and almost list what adaptations they've got there and would they work in a different habitat. So where do wings work? Do wings work underwater or do they work more in a grassland or a woodland habitat? What about breathing? How do the water animals breathe underwater? There's so many pond animals that actually can't breathe underwater, which is a slight design flaw, I think. But they've got amazing adaptations so they can go underwater and stay under there for prolonged periods of time. Interdependence is the way in which organisms depend on each other. So we can collect data by looking at how many we've got of the different trophic levels. So we've got the herbivores, the primary consumers, and the top predators. So if we're counting each one, so this bit of equipment here in the middle, you might notice it. It's just a tray that they use for school for lunches, but it's divided into the different trophic levels. We've got the sun, then we've got plants, then we've got herbivores, then we've got carnivores in the red. And if you can collect them, obviously they don't stay in there for very long, not the moving ones, but you can then tally how much you've got of each one and you can start to see, right, do we have a top heavy pyramid? So we have too many predators or too many prey. And then there's some great games that you can play. You can test these ideas. So you've got your school, your class. Most of them are going to be the prey, but you've got like 2 predators. And then you see how long it takes for the predators to catch the prey. And then you change the parameters. You either remove any shelter or you remove the area, or you make sure that they have to come and get food in an area. And then you can add poisons and see how that goes up through the food chain. So building in some food chain and some predator-prey games really helps to bring that alive as well. Food webs. So if you can create your own food web based on the animals that you've found, you get everybody to choose one of the animals we found in your habitat. Somebody stands in the middle as a tree, and then they have to try and link everybody by just attaching them with holding onto a bit of string. So just holding onto a bit of wool works. So if you're relying on the tree by eating it, then you stand by the tree. If you then eat one of those animals, you stand behind them. And then I like to do that and then be very mean and say, right, I'm going to cut the tree down. And then when I cut the tree down, if you've got nothing at the end of your string, then obviously you're going to die because you've got nothing to eat. And then the next stage and the next steps, you can see the impact of damage to the environment on the whole of the food web, not just the people, the animals that are living on the tree itself. Then nutrient cycling, so trying to get the learners to move from that food web or food chain, which is a line, to the cyclical system we've got in the real world by saying, right, we got to the food, we got to the predator. How do we get back to our plants? So obviously we're looking at, we can just represent these things with items that we find. So we've got our figures of mini beasts, so we can use them as models or something, or puppets. And then of course, this will die and turn into leaf litter. Then you bring in the worms, mushrooms and fungi and water, and that all creates nutrients that turn into the soil, and then that grows back into the plants. So this nutrient cycling can then be modeled right next to where it's happening. The structure of plants. I've just been growing some lovely crocus bulbs so I can see the roots, which has been fantastic to spot. But it's quite hard to see the roots of things like trees. But if you investigate them, all you need, again, is a knitting needle. You walk away from the tree in lots of different directions. You drop the knitting needle and it will hit the soil, and then it will either go down or it won't go very far down. And that's where your roots are. So you can try and map how far the roots go out from it. And it actually is as wide as the canopy, which is quite impressive, really. You can, in wintertime, great to see the structure of the tree by drawing tree skeletons. So you look at the tree itself and you identify the shape of it and all the different ways in which the plant is adapted to get as maximum amount of sunlight. And then, of course, once you start getting the leaves coming out, you can start to identify them, making leaf identification guides by either rubbing trees, and you can think about how we can build a tree. So this picture here on the bottom right is a fantastic, quite complex tree structure we've got here. So we've got the hardwood, and then around the outside you've got the bark, and then you've got the lateral roots down the bottom, and each aspect of that actually says a different thing. So they've each got a job to do, and they say a word, and then you get the tree to all come together to actually make the whole tree work. But it really brings to light how complicated these trees actually are. Okay, also we can think about leaf identification as well. So like I said about mini beast identification guides, if you can create leaf identification guides, then they're really useful to use with your lower school. Moving on to reproduction, plant reproduction, you can use the flowers that you've grown for your pollinators. You can look at flower dissection. You can look at them, especially if you've got fruit trees. Fruit trees are brilliant for looking at reproduction, because you see the blossom and then the blossom will fall off, and then you'll see where the blossom was as the bottom end of the apple starting to grow. And as the ovary gets bigger, that's your apple growing. And it really is brilliant to see that life cycle as well. You can also have a go at pollinating things yourself. So if you've got tomato plants, you can use a paintbrush to move the pollen from one side to the other. Wind pollination experiments, and similar to seed dispersal investigations here. So you're creating a model to actually investigate it. So finding seeds that pollinate, that move in different ways, sycamore seeds, and then making a model and then trying it out and see how far it moves. Things like cleavers, goosegrass that has Velcro on it, sticks to the animals. So just trialing how far away from the parent plant these seeds are getting based on their structure and how they're adapted to try and get as far away from it as well. And then the color investigation, as I've said about this one here in the middle, that's this color investigation. So you're looking at the plants, and every time a bee or a pollinator comes to a flower, you then put a Lego block inside the appropriate cut next to the color. And then by the time you finish your investigation, you actually put all the Lego blocks stuck together and you end up with a vertical graph straight away. So you can see your data very obviously, the great data presentation there. Organs of the body. Now, the outdoors is a great, huge open space, hopefully, that you can use to model the systems of the body. And I've done this with every system I can possibly think of. So skeletons is done quite often, creating a skeleton, but making it as accurate as you can, using the right number of bones or the right number of twigs in the right places, labeling it. But then also looking at animals and trying to sketch them and label where their organs are, because of course with mini beasts it's very different, isn't it, trying to identify where their heart is, where they think their lungs are, etc. And you can start with easy plant sketching, so looking at the veins, etc. So if you do rubbings and then you start to identify where the organs are, again you can use the roots as well, either to press them, you can rub them, or you can just sketch them. So it just gives you that idea of what's going on under the surface as well as above the surface, the bits that we always see. But if we can grow them, so this is my crocus here that's I just started on this picture and is now growing really well. I don't know if you can see that, in case you can. There it is now. You can see that. So watching the roots grow is fantastic, and if you've got a way of exposing it, but it gives you an idea with this, with you start our seed investigation, what we looked at in What Matters Statement 1, seeing how plants grow, which grows first, the root or the shoot, and trying to think about why that's the case. Hormones, plant hormones have a huge impact on the growth of plants, and you can do this with an investigation using a plant called plantain. Plantain is a longleaf plant which has got stripy leaves, and they're found in nearly all grasses. So in any field you will find it. Now they're brilliant because, unlike most plants, if they're in an area where there's low light levels, so where there's shade or where they're in long grass, instead of just dying, they grow taller. So you get tall plantain in long grass, and you don't have tall plantain in short grass because they're already getting enough light. So they've got shorter leaves. So it's not really what everyone expects, but it's because of these tropisms, these hormones. And you can test that by this lovely experiment here with the box, where you put a plant inside a box with a hole that has the light and see if the plant can actually make its way there. And it's the tropisms, the hormones, that moves it and makes it grow left or right, depending on where the hole is, so they can get to the light. So it's this adaptation. And then, of course, we can look at the impact of growth. We can actually force things to grow differently as well. This tree here, obviously, you can see where the growth is on one side compared to the other. But you could also prune something, especially fruit trees or shrubs, and see what happens to their height as you plant, as you actually take off their side branches. And that's all to do with hormones as well. Okay, so that is What Matters Statement 3. Any questions on the living world, plants and animals? No? Okay, fantastic. Right, so moving on to What Matters Statement 4. So we're looking at materials now. So What Matters is all about really covers materials, their properties, classifying them. So things like dissolving, separating, states of matter, conductivity, malleability, so all those properties, but also chemical reactions, separating materials, the composition of materials, and also there's a weird bit on there on natural resources, on ores, which I think they put in because of Minecraft, to be honest. So how are we going to teach that? So most of the detail of this What Matters statement is actually in the content of the key considerations part, the special considerations. So if you look at the What Matters statement, if I just go back, then there's not a lot there. Just as I can recognize that changes in materials affect their property and use under different conditions. Doesn't look like a lot, but if you look at the considerations, there's actually a lot to cover in this, and lots of it, well, all of it, you can actually do outside. So in terms of What Matters Statement 1, we can go on a materials hunt around your school grounds. So we can just ask what materials we got and why, and just man-made things, natural things, but also thinking about why they chose that material for that use. So thinking about bringing in some of that vocabulary. We can also sort materials by their property. So sorting hard, soft, also natural, man-made. This is great if you go somewhere where they've got a range of materials. So strand lines are brilliant for sorting materials because you've got man-made, natural, and you've got a variety of hard and soft materials there as well. Describing materials. So again, bringing in this vocabulary of words, a lot of that in the content here. And if you do an activity called Meet a Tree, then they've got to use their language to try and describe it. So you blindfold them, they're taken to a tree, and then you ask them to describe what they feel. So it helps if they've got a good set of vocabulary for this. But then they start to think about, again, properties. So if it's not just a tree, going to meet a material and find out why is that got that material property and why is it being used for that. And then, as I said before, linking this to the Three Pigs house. So we can make houses and you can try and blow them down. I like to bring in bellows and try and blow them down with my puppet, my wolf puppet. And then they can see which properties make the strongest house and which one don't. And also I like to use, a lot of schools have got those foam bricks. I've done an investigation with reception where or was it nursery? Well, foundation phase anyway. And so they were looking at this structure. They made a wall thinking that it would never blow down. And then we stood in front of it, or the students did, and they blew it down. And then we thought, right, how can we redesign it to make it stronger? Because when they designed it first, they were doing one brick on top of each other. It was, I must say, I slightly fudged the results. But once they actually made it again overlapping, it was much stronger and it didn't blow down when they all blew. Progression step 2, thinking about making potions is a great way, and it links into expressive arts, but it also links into separation as well. So they mix lots of things they find outdoors, and then they need to separate it. So how are they going to separate the grass from the liquid? How are they going to separate the sand from the stones? So many opportunities outside to provide separation and also problem solving there as well. Dissolving, again, a brilliant way of introducing the scientific method and fair testing. But if you especially at progression step 2, if you let the learners investigate freely with solids that they do and don't dissolve, so they can find out for themselves, not just provide them with the same ones, and get them to ask questions like, well, where did the solid go? And can we get it back? So again, linking into separation techniques. And then density, floating and sinking, great done in puddles. So again, linking to a science investigation, we can think about which materials make boats float, and then we can try and get them to sink. So we're linking into forces then as well, which is in the next What Matters statement. So you can then put more and more heavy things on top of it and see if we can sink it. Moving on to the next progression steps. So science investigations into properties, so many opportunities there, but making it meaningful is really important. So waterproof materials. So which one's the most waterproof, which is the most absorbent, which one is the strongest, but make it a reason for them to do it. So we want to make a pair of wellies to go outside. We want them to be waterproof. What material can we use? And we'll test it outside and see if it works. Absorbent materials, we want to get rid of the puddles in the schoolyard so that we don't have to run around them at playtime. What material can we use to absorb it all? And then waterproofing, making dens, we want to make it a waterproof den. So what material should we use? Or strongest, we want a strong den. What material can we use? And then Great Friar of London, a lot of schools are doing this, which is a great humanities and designing, but usually it's an expressive arts activity. But you can turn it into a scientific inquiry by saying, well, which properties of a material could stop the Great Fire of London? So you do your Fire of London, but then you create something that was in the middle that could stop it. So some material that wouldn't be flammable, that wouldn't allow the spreading of it. Or maybe even a wind block to stop the wind, because one of the reasons the Great Fire of London went on for so long was because of the wind direction and the wind strength. So you can link in a science investigation in there. And I like to time, when we burn the houses, if they're made of different materials, time how long it takes for each one to burn. So we can either do the size or the material. So some have got straw house roofs, some don't. And then which ones will burn fastest. So again, bringing in some science and some measuring in there as well. Cleaning water is a good investigation into separation technique, and again, go outside and find that dirty water and try and make it clean. If you're doing states of matter, then you can use the outdoors as a great space to just test the terminology that you're going to use. And so if they're a solid, they need to be next to each other just vibrating in nice straight lines. If they're liquid, they're moving a bit more. If they're gases, they're running around. But then you use the right terminology. So you say condense, and they need to go back into a liquid, and melt, and they turn back into a liquid from solid. So using the terminology to test their understanding of the states of matter and the processes there. Properties of solid, liquids and gases. This picture on the top right here, this is a homemade thermometer. They're quite tricky to make, but if you get capillary tubing and you get a glass bottle, if you put alcohol and water in the bottom with some food colouring, and you make sure it's airtight at the top with clay, then as you heat up that liquid at the bottom, it will go up the thermometer. So you can make your own thermometer using the properties of liquids as an explanation of why it works. Melting and freezing, and again, lots of things you can use outside which will melt and freeze in our temperature, so ice and wax. And if you've got a fire, if it's not sunny, if you can do fires in your school grounds, great opportunity for melting things and to watch what happens as they melt, and also as they solidify again as it cools down. Again, using a fire, we can look at boiling, so boiling water on the kettle. Kelly kettles are great, and they've got gases inside, and they've got this space, so you can see how the gas actually expands to fill the space. And you can also investigate evaporation, condensation. So as the fire boils, so you can watch it boil in a saucepan, but then if you put something there like a mirror, it will then hit it and condense. You can also, if you've got a fire, you can then dissolve the salt and you can evaporate it. Or if not, if it's warm, you can get it to evaporate with the sun, and you can again use that form of separation to get the salt back from being dissolved. Condensation, this picture here in the middle, this is actually a water rocket. And if you make water rockets, when it fires, when it comes back, because of the pressure, not the heat, you actually create condensation inside the tube. So it's like a cloud, so how clouds are formed. So you can try to look at condensation compared to boiling and see how it can happen with pressure and not just with heat. So if you don't have a fire source, you can do that. We can also think about chemical reactions. So if you've got a fire, there's so much you can do in terms of chemical reactions. Obviously, you've got combustion, but you can also do reversible and non-reversible reactions by melting things. So you can do reversible by melting chocolate and make it solidify, or non-reversible by cooking an egg or cooking marshmallows. And so again, bringing the science into things you might actually be doing in forest school or out in your outdoor learning already. Rockets, Alka-Seltzer rockets, these are on the bottom here. So if you need a container which has a stopper that just pushes in, fill it up with, not fill it, but half fill it with vinegar, put an Alka-Seltzer tablet in it. The reaction will create carbon dioxide. The pressure will make the bottom or the top fly off. And if you put it upside down, that will create forces that will push down balance forces, and that will take your rocket into the air. So linking to forces there as well. And then the last one, the extraction of metal with ores. Now, this is quite a high level thing that you probably do with year sixes, but you can actually, if you get hold of iron ore and you have a fire, you can actually get the metal out of ores. And I think with Minecraft and all that, that the students would absolutely love doing that, to see how the iron can actually come out of iron ore. Right, next one then. So the What Matters Statement 5 covers, basically it's physics really. So it's energy, forces, light, sound, electricity and magnetism. And again, loads of opportunities for science investigation and exploring all of we can do in the outdoors. So this content is covered in the What Matters Statement. So that's why it looks so big. So, but you can see everything I've underlined here. All the aspects of the content that we need to cover. So how can we do it outside? So first of all, we can investigate energy, different energy forms. So if you're looking around your school grounds, you can look at sources of energy. So surveying to look for potential energy, so chemical energy, electrical energy. So you can actually map that energy and find out where it is. And it also gets you to test their understanding of energy forms, because it is quite a difficult concept to do without seeing it. You can also investigate energy transfer, so anything that moves from one energy form to another, you can see that energy transform. And some things that you might have, pieces of equipment in your school, maybe in nursery reception, are great examples of energy transfer. So we've got water wheels, marble rums, so anything that's moving your gravitational into kinetic, you can see that really well. And then if you want to do roller coasters, you'll link to that. So if you're building roller coasters using your design methods from What Matters Statement 2, you could then also try and use energy for them to describe what's happening in it. So where is the centrifugal force? What energy is working most? And if you're looking at drawing energy diagrams, so you can do the arrows pointing in the way that energy, the highest energy is going. And then obviously it's not balancing if it's moving, but if it's staying at a constant speed, or if it's not moving, then they're balanced. So what's the other energy force that is actually the force that's pushing in the other way as well? So you're bringing in forces and you're showing the energy transfers at the same time. Rockets, air rockets, water rockets, chemical rockets, so many there, and that links in nicely to forces. So we're talking about balanced forces and unbalanced forces. And if you get them to see it and plan it as an investigation, like how do we make the rocket go the highest, they can also think about those forces and draw some force diagrams as well to show where the forces are working. Energy, again, dynamos, if you've got water wheels, if you've got access to downpipes that actually are exposed at the bottom, you can get water wheels at the bottom connected to dynamos, and you can see how much energy you can actually generate. So you can see if you could save some money in your school grounds by generating energy from the downpipes of your roof. So that's a nice little project that you can do. I've said before about renewable energy resources, go around your school grounds looking for a science investigation into solar or wind power, so linking it in with energy here. Fires provide you with so much in terms of heat transfer, so measuring the temperature at different distances away from the fire, or creating a barrier to heat. So see if you can heat up water on a different type of fire. So it could be a wood fire, coal fire, paper fire, gas stove, and then testing how long it takes for the water to heat up to a certain temperature, or how hot it gets after 5 minutes. You can also investigate combustion and heat transfer by trying to make the fire hotter. So different wood types actually burn at different heats. You can actually have a cold fire. So, and this links in with chemical reactions as well as materials. So you pick your material, you test it, see what the heat transfer is, then you test a different material and see which one is the best. Thermal conductivity investigation, I said before, again, this example here, the picture shows you how we can try and keep water warm or keep ice from melting using natural materials. Another way of doing it is to use different materials, saucepans made out of different materials, and see how long it takes for something like chocolate to melt on a not even a very hot fire. So you can have a copper, an aluminium, and a steel pan, and see which one conducts the most heat by heating up your either thermometer or melts the chocolate or the ice. And then reflecting the heat, again, we can relate that into either solar oven, or if you've got a fire, you can place different materials next to the fire, and then you can measure the reflected heat with a thermometer. Or if you haven't got that, you could use even a heat lamp or an old lamp. The old light bulbs give off quite a bit of heat. And then the last one, what was the best way of stopping wasting heat energy at your school? So thinking about surveying the energy loss in your school building. So looking, especially works well when you've got snow on your roof, to see which bit of the school grounds has not got snow anymore. That's a loss of heat. And you could also measure the temperature outside the building, compare it to inside the building, and see which part has got the biggest difference, and therefore it's probably wasting the most heat. Okay, forces, specifically, we can investigate speed. So toy cars, so you do this quite often, looking at friction probably, but again, thinking about your school grounds, how could you use the angle of slopes or different materials like grass, gravel and tarmac to change the amount of friction? Much more realistic than driving down a book. I don't think anyone drives down books, but they do drive down grass, they do drive down tarmac and gravel. We can also investigate which surface you can move heavy objects over. So again, using different materials, so different land use, grass, gravel, and then trying to move heavy objects. And that can link into the Egyptians and how they used rollers and how they used rotational forces there to reduce the use the friction. We can also try, if you want to stick with friction, making fires by friction. So that's a great heat transfer as well. Really hard, but it's a technique, but it's a great way of getting them to start thinking about how we lose energy through heat when we have friction. Investigating compression and changing in direction of balls. So just watching balls as they hit the ground, especially if you've got slow motion filming, watch how balls get deformed as they hit the floor, so that they can see how the force is actually affecting the shape of the ball. Great way of doing that without actually using slow motion is crater experiments. So putting trays of flour, especially if you've got a small layer of paint on the top, powder paint, dropping your projectile. So golf balls are great for that, dropping them at a set height and see what happens to the crater, the size when you change the weight or the height of the object that's dropped. Air resistance, if you've got height in your school grounds, investigating parachute size and the shape. So again, this links to water rockets. So you could try and get the best parachute that's going to go on the top of your water rocket. Sailboats, if you want to introduce wind resistance. So if you've got connects, they could build a sail boat if you've got water, or it could be a sail land yacht if you've just got grounds, and then put in your sail. Bigger the wind, wing of the sail, does that mean it goes the fastest? Simple machines, great way of looking at forces. So looking around your school grounds for simple machines like levers, pulleys, inclined planes, screws and wedges, and you can use those to identify the forces involved. And there's a lot of ways in which you can work against gravity. You can create Archimedes screw using guttering as well, to looking at going uphill. Water pumps, water rockets, air rockets, all this is investigating in forces as well. And one I like to do is do heavy objects fall faster. So dropping objects and weighing them and seeing which one falls to the ground fastest. And that links in with the lowest key stage. You might want to do kite flying and investigating what size the shape of the kite can actually create a greatest force and therefore lift the highest weight. And then lastly, water squirters, again, looking at those pump water squirters and which one can fire the furthest. Right, okay. Last bit on this What Matters statement, looking at magnetism and light and sound and electricity. So this is the last bit of the What Matters statement 5. So there's quite a lot of content within this one. UV investigation, I've mentioned. This is the color changing guide that you get with the UV beads. And there's a great resource I've created a Padlet, which has got a huge amount of resources that are all available online, and it gets them all in one place. And there's a great one that was a STEM resource that was brought out when Tim Peake went up to the space station. And this is where this UV comes from. And he's got some great STEM ideas there, some of which you can do outside. Investigating light around your school grounds. So is there more light under the trees? So again, you can actually download a lux meter on your iPad, which is a free app, and it will measure how much light there is. You can do it all around your school grounds and create some data as well. You can also think about shadows and light being blocked by the trees. So where are the shadows form, and investigating the size of them over the days, and also creating things like sundials by using it. You can use the light to send messages around your school grounds, especially if it's a dull, dark winter's day. So using mirrors and torches and creating periscopes, and then reflecting the light and sending messages around corners. That's a good way of them understanding the properties of light to send a message around the corners. Soundscapes, looking at the way in which sound moves around your school grounds by listening in different places and seeing what you can hear and trying to find the source of it and try and kind of work out the route in which that sound took. And again, looking at properties of sound. And if you survey your school ground and actually do a sound survey, a map, you can identify the sources of the sound, but also the way in which it bounces around off the buildings, etc. And then you could build barriers to sound, test them out. It's a science investigation, and see, like I said before, how sound travels furthest. You can investigate echoes, but moving further or closer to buildings, and see how this affects the sound. And last of all, looking at waves in terms of electricity, so creating electrical circuits You can't literally do them outside, but you can model them so that you can get the students to be the electrical circuit. You can use hose pipes, especially if you're doing things like resistance or potential. So the number of batteries, the higher the potential, so the bigger the push. So you put more water into the pipe, and the higher the resistance, the higher you lift the hose. And so that's going to make it have to work harder to get uphill. So it's modeling all those terms in electricity in a different way. And then lastly, investigating waves in puddles. So we can look at this puddle here shows really good interference and refraction. And you can do this in tanks and tough trays, but you can start to model where these waves are going and how they actually interfere with each other. Right, any questions on What Matters Statement 5 on all the physics? Nope, I know there is an awful lot of stuff. Hopefully you know, anything that is useful to you is going to be good. But this is the last What Matters statement. And this again is something very different from this, probably the science that you've done in the past, because this is about the computation. Now you might think, well, this is computers, this is digital, this doesn't work outside. But in fact, there are some great opportunities for teaching that underlying computation of algorithms that you can do outside for sequencing, etc. So it's all about the process of a set of instructions to be followed in calculating or problem solving operations. Okay, so that if you understand that that is what it is in terms of algorithms of computation, then that can definitely be used outdoors. And this is how you do it. So when you're talking about algorithms, you can start really simple in progression step 1, and you're just trying to sequence and follow a sequence of instructions. And that can be done by introducing these words of conditional statements through games. So Simon Says, now starting obviously in progression step 1, your Simon Says, you say your conditional statement. So when I say, so if I put my hand up, then you put your hand up. Okay, so we start with something very simple. Then when we start to get on to more complex ones, we can just add more of those conditional statements. So we can add in else. So one programmer, and it is the person who says everything, and everyone else is your computer. So the programmer gives the instructions. So if I stand, then you stand. Okay. When we get into progression step 2, so if I stand, you sit. Then we increase by adding if, then, else. So if I raise my left arm, else raise your right foot. So that means that if the programmer does nothing, just stands still, the computers should actually raise their right foot. So we increase the challenge by increasing the speed, and also you can get the computers, if they do it wrong, to break, and then they come out when they get it wrong. And then once the learners have the hang of this coding language, then they can use it to create their own instructions to follow a course around the schoolyard. So it doesn't have to be a static thing. So you can also, if you want to, replace the instructions with sounds. So if I clap once, then you walk forward. If I clap twice, then you turn left. So it's getting that understanding of an instruction and what the actual process required to actually create an algorithm. So if you're using conditional statements, you can then use it following nature as your guide. So somebody doesn't decide what happens. You just decide the parameters of your algorithm. So you use an area, great in autumn when you've got lots of different coloured leaves. So you've got different coloured leaves all over the yard. You choose a start and an end point, and you label them. So we need to get to there. And then you come up with the design of the rules of your program. So when you reach a yellow leaf, you turn left. When you reach an orange leaf, you turn right. And when you reach a green leaf, you walk backwards. Based on those parameters, you then try the program by starting from your start point and see where you end up. Now, if you don't get to the end, you need to then debug your code. And then you need to do that by changing the rules and see if you can then make it to the finish line. If it doesn't, you come back, you debug. So the process of algorithms and debugging is all brought in through this. You can then bring in the repeating patterns and loops. So you can create array of boxes. So this top right-hand picture here is an array of boxes. So it's just a load of squares. If you haven't got that in your yard, you can actually use a hopscotch. It's just something which has got distinct places where you can stand and put things in or move. And then you put an object somewhere in that array, either at the end of the hopscotch or somewhere in the boxes. And then one computer stands at the start line. So they're doing the movement. And then the programmer comes up with an algorithm to get them to actually collect that object. So you can start by letting them write it down. So on this bottom right here, you can see that they're drawing an arrow. They could draw the arrow and then the computer moves. And then you can aim is to try and get them all the way to pick up that stone. So each time the programmer draws an arrow, the computer will then move in that direction. So with progression step 3, so as we move on, if the computer is going wrong, then you obviously have to start back and debug and try it again. And then once you've got this system, this sequence, then you can do it in multiple directions at the same time. So you can create an algorithm of it, a repeating loop. So you can also teach this concept of loops, that once you've got that in that box there, that is the loop. And you no longer need to program it. You just have that as your loop. And the computer is happy to do the loop and repeat and repeat and repeat. And it means your instructions are much more efficient without you having to repeat all the arrows up and down, up and down. And building from that basic understanding, you can then get them to start creating their own treasure hunts around the school grounds. So they can practice following algorithms by you giving them a set of instructions which are set in an algorithmic form. So take 10 steps forward, 5 hoops to the left, hops to the left, forward until you reach the oak tree, or whatever you use to actually get them to the locations. And then once they get to that location, they have to write their own algorithm to get back to where they started from. You can also use repeating patterns and loops to create an algorithm to make a trail around your school grounds. So they could come up with the trail and then they come up with the algorithm to get the trail followed. You can also use algorithms to create instructions for anything that you're undertaking outdoors. So it could be that you're lighting a fire and you write the instructions there, and that's your algorithm, or building a den, or creating a woodland creature. Now, it doesn't have to be anything too complicated. Again, you could start with something really simple, but the important thing is they arrange the elements in the correct order so that the algorithm actually works. And again, if it doesn't work, they need to debug. They also need to try and simplify it. So if you put any repeating loops, so for example, you put a stick on the roof, you put another stick on the roof, this would be a repeating loop, and you do that until you've finished the whole roof of your den. And then you test the finished algorithm, and then you follow the instructions to reconstruct the elements. So you use it to actually build whatever you're doing. So you're testing it then. Okay. So there are loads of other ideas that you can do for algorithms and coding. And there's loads on the Padlet. So if you're not sure what I'm talking about, have a look at the Padlet for some really good ideas. And I think this is the last bit we're going through, is the sensors and actuators. Now, this is physical computing, which is really a great opportunity to integrate the digital and the real world. So we're kind of making sense of science and using digital technology to help us with the outdoor space. So data loggers are great for that. If you've got access to data loggers, then you can use sensors to collect data. Now, a data logger could be a weather station. So lots of schools have got weather stations, but it's a digital one. It's got to be a digital one, not an analog one. And this will create a large database in your school. So it could be that you've got the air temperature, wind speed, and light intensity being measured every day in your weather station. So that's your data logger. And that's providing it with data over the whole year for years and years. So that's you using sensors and actuators. You can also use sensors and actuators to think about an investigation. So we can use it to cover and store data that you then use for investigating changes over time in terms of your climate. So for a long-term data set, you could actually use that to see if you've got global climate change happening in your school grounds. You could use GPSs, either if you've got a iPad which has actually got a SIM in it, so you can see a GPS, or if you've got old phones or old GPS ones, you could set a trail around your school grounds using their GPS signal they use find locations. So they're using it. You place markers. You could use Google Maps for this as well, and place markers around your school grounds. They need to find it using the GPS or the unit. And then when you get there, you need to scan a QR code, for example, and that will take you to the next location or ask you a question that you've got to answer. You can also collect so much data from your school grounds and present it digitally. So all of the science investigations we've done, a lot of them, you can collect that data on a digital device, especially if you've got something. There's a great app called Survey 123. Now, you don't use the actual device to measure, you use it to collect the data. So Survey 123 allows you to create basically like a results table. And when you get there, it will geolocate the data. So if you're collecting wind speed meters, where you are standing, if you type in the wind speed, it will geolocate it to that place. So when you go inside, you then can upload it onto Google Earth, and then you can see all your results all the way around your school grounds. So it's a great way of presenting your data in a geographical way as well as a mathematical way as well. There's also lots of problem solving outdoors that can be addressed using actuators and sensors. And you don't have to actually have the equipment to do it. It's almost more about the design than anything else. So I've said about the irrigation system that you could do, but how about making sure you've got sensors and actuators in there? So the sensor needs to sense that the plant needs watering so that the soil is dry, and then think about where that needs to take place. And then you've got an actuator that responds to that. Now that could turn on the hose, it could tip a bucket, it could just send out a signal that says you need to water the plants. So lots of opportunities there. And you could also do designs for automatic door opening devices for your school grounds, for your chicken coops. So when the sun comes up, the door opens so the chickens can come out. Bird feeders. So when the bird's food is run out, then it sends out an alarm saying, or if it's run out, then there's another pile on top that comes through on a little door. There's just so many things you can do. It's just depends on what equipment you've got or what ideas you've got, but also give them the opportunity to come up with their own ideas as well. Right, so that's it with the ideas. I hope that's given you something to go on. As a follow-up to this course, I have lots of resources that are available on the Padlet. So I just show you the Padlet now. I'm just going to stop sharing this and show you the Padlet. So this is the Padlet. Hopefully you should see that. And if you scroll along, then you can see it's health and safety, outdoor learning resources, get to science and technology. There's loads of ideas here about planting, but also the automatic watering system, lots about the coding algorithms, and lots of STEM activities. So that's available. When you get the PowerPoint sent to you, you can just click on the Padlet there and you'll get that information. As I said, Becca, sorry, just seen it. Great. So yeah, click on the link on the PowerPoint and then you'll get to the Padlet. This course is part of, when I did it originally, it was part of a 20-session course that I'm doing across all of the AOLEs, but also every aspect of outdoor learning. So if you want to go on any of those courses, we're on session 11 now. Next week, we're doing health and wellbeing AOLE. The other 11 sessions are also available on my Nature Days shop. So if you want to just get a recording of it and the PowerPoint, then if you go to the Nature Days shop, you can just buy the session there. I am repeating some others as well. I'm doing the maths and numeracy one again. So if you want to go on Eventbrite, you'll be able to find all of those sessions. I've also created a outdoor learning challenge card, which are aimed at Key Stage 2. So here, on the right here, you can see the example. This is the science and technology one. They're divided into the 6 AOLEs, and it's £50 for the whole set, or you can buy the different AOLEs separately. And it's a digital resource, so you get a copy of all of these cards, which basically help your learners to independently undertake an outdoor learning challenge. And it gives them success criteria and some questions to help them, and also pictures of ways in which they could do, like Raggles. And they're great for putting in outdoor learning resources and also for using in PPA, or if you've got teachers coming in, you want them to do outdoor learning, but they're not sure exactly what to do. And they cover lots of different themes, so you're not stuck with specific ones for specific themes. You can manipulate them. And when you get a digital download, you can print them off as much as you like or share them with people in your school as well. I also do insets, bespoke insets for your school. So if you would like to have some more specific training on your school grounds, I will come to your school grounds, as long as you don't live too far away from me, and go through how you can teach any aspect of the curriculum in your school grounds. And I also do field trips, which are based on Gower. So if you're close to Gower and you'd like to come out and like me to teach your children, then that would be fantastic. And I'm also starting a subscription service, because I was writing a book over lockdown about the new curriculum, but it's turning into a subscription service of how to teach the new curriculum outdoors. So hopefully that will help you. And then last of all, if just to make sure that you take something away from this that you can use, just a bit of homework if you want, try if you can, maybe in the next week, just while it's fresh in your mind, see if you can integrate some of these ideas I've given you today into the planning of your science and technology you're doing in the next week or so, or maybe next term. So just thinking about any of those, like, oh, I'd like to try that. So just, it makes it a lot more meaningful if you try it with your learners. And lastly, I would love to get feedback from you about the course. On the feedback form, you can just scan the QR code or click on the feedback form when you get the PowerPoint. It's got questions about what you liked, but also any future training you'd like. It's also got on there a Hub email account. If you have a Hub email account, it's really useful if you haven't actually booked through that. If you pass me your Hub account, email account, either by putting it in the chat now or emailing it through the feedback form, then when I share this PowerPoint with the recording embedded in it, I can do it through Hub, which is a lot easier. Otherwise, it will be through WeTransfer. So if you get it through WeTransfer because you don't have a Hub account, please do actually download it as soon as you get it, because it has got a time frame. I think it's a week it will stay there available. So if you lose it after a week, just email me and I will send it to you again. So if you've liked this session and you'd like to come back for another, next week we've got the Health and Wellbeing AOLE, and then that's the 16th, but also we've got Maths and Numeracy on the 30th, I think it is. So, right, so we have 2 minutes. If anyone has any questions, I think in the chat, everything is just your Hub email account, so that's brilliant, thank you. But if anyone wants any comments, any questions, I've probably just, filled your brains, hopefully, and you're exhausted, but hopefully there's a lot of things there that you can use. Yeah, thank you, Becca. Yeah, that is the point of this, is me giving you as many ideas as possible. Yeah, Donna, it is great to have that resource. And again, looking at the new curriculum and thinking about your school grounds, if you're creating resources that are based on the things you find in your school grounds, you're much more likely to make it meaningful for your learners. So yeah.